Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this lovely Bianchi Sprint. There's a lot going on with this bike. The bottom bracket area had a lot of problems. The chain set was rubbing the chainstay, so we need to sort that out. You can see it needed cabling, brakes. We replaced the headset bearings, bottom bracket bearings, wheel bearings. We had a problem with the hub, which we also sorted out. All in all, this bike was in a pretty sorry state. You can see here the grime of build-up of leaves and debris that was on the bike. The front wheel wouldn't actually turn, so we needed to retension that. You can actually see that here, that it's running untrue in the brake pads there. Every rotation it's grabbing the brake pads. That not only would wear out the brake pads, but would make it a very awkward bike to ride. You can see here the chain is at 1% stretch. On an old bike of this nature, they actually cope quite well with a chain that has been worn completely out like this. The teeth on the chain rings are much deeper than a modern bike. They're obviously made of steels, where modern bikes are made of aluminiums, so they react to a worn chain a little bit less than perhaps a more modern bike. But this did need a change, so we will replace that as we're doing the service. What I'm going to do with this bike is I'm actually going to strip this right the way back to the frame. That way we can clean and detail the frame and also go through every component on the bike on the bench to make sure that it is okay to refit. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm removing the components on the bike. Here we're removing the rear derailleur that comes off its hanger, and I will also remove all the cables. But you can see here the build up. There's a very thick oil on this bike, very thick grease. This bike had been serviced, but I would say very amateurish in that none of the components had actually been cleaned. They'd just been heavily greased, and it was a story throughout the bike, which we'll show you along the way, especially in the bottom bracket area. It had clearly been serviced, but not quite correctly, so we'll deal with that as we're going. You can see here front derailleur, again that build up of grease and debris. Just needs a good clean and a correct lubrication to make that component work nicely. I'm going to remove the cables because we're going to be replacing all the cables on this bike, so we will get those out and off of the bike, and then I will also remove these shifters. This is a friction system, so it isn't a modern indexing system. This you would do by feel. As you change gear, you would pull those down. They're friction fitted onto the frame, and that's what gives you your indexing on the gears. Now we're going to remove these plastic mountain bike pedals that this bike had on it. We're going to take those off. We actually found a nice little set of pedals to go on this bike. Listen here. Hear that tapping? What actually happened here, one of the chain set bolts was missing when the bike came in, but another one had obviously been replaced at some point, this one here. You can hear there, just slightly too long. This chain set was very close to the chain stay, and that bolt was kissing the chain stay, scratching it quite nastily, causing that tapping sound. It would have been horrendous to have ridden this bike the way it was. It would have driven me up the walls, so we needed to address that when we're servicing the bike as well. So this has cotter pins in this bike, so we need to tap those out before we can remove the chain set itself, but that came out nicely. Off came the chain set, and you can see here that it's weathered. You know, it is deteriorating. There's a little bit of corrosion on there. We can really bring that up nicely so that your eye is taken away from the corrosion. It won't affect the part mechanically, so it doesn't really matter, but it's what makes a bike really look nice and interesting if it's nice and shiny. So we're going to deal with all that. But notice these cups on this bottom bracket area here. I was actually really pleased with the way these came up during the service. They looked like new when they went back on. It was quite surprising. But look at this axle. Look at the thickness of that white grease in the center there. I would imagine that at some point these were caged bearings, so I'd imagine someone's pulled that out, doused it in grease and put it back in without even cleaning the cups or the bearings. Just by adding grease, they feel that that's a service to the bike. There are a few other bits which will show you. Again, here you can see the bearings are in cages, but it's just had that thick white lithium grease put on top of the original grease. Not really a service, it's a lubrication, but obviously if you've got grit and dirt in there, you're just allowing that to stick even more to the bearings and wear them even more. So it's important to clean that out before you grease it, which is what we're going to do with this service. Off comes the brakes now. These calipers we actually spent a little bit of time on, which we'll show you along the way in the video, to really bring those up nicely, and I was absolutely thrilled. This before and after shot of this front end is amazing. Very, very pleased with the brakes, especially on this bike. But we're going to take those off first, ready for that process. A little bit tight getting out the front forks there, you can see. There was a lot of debris through the hole, so that was just grabbing it. And you can see there how the spring is a little bit grimy. There's a lot of grime on the back. That's been greased at the top there, which wouldn't really lubricate. It was just added to the part rather than doing any lubrication process. Bottle cage here, I actually replaced the bolts that hold this on. You'll see that when we finish the bike. They were very, very rusty and they had a flat head on them which is a little bit damaged, so I actually replaced those along the way. I feel parts like that, it's not detrimental to the originality of the bike. If I do replace little parts like nuts and bolts, I think that actually adds to it. Look at this under there. Under the bar tape that I've took off is an original bit of bar tape that's sticky from it that was never cleaned off properly. You'll see it under this black tape here as well. You can see that brownness. There's a little bit of sticky residue there. You can see from an original bar tape. Again, someone's took old bar tape off, replaced it, but not cleaned the bars up. That brown area there was actually rust that was bleeding through into the old sticky. It looks an awful lot worse than it is. We will clean that up and we will remove all that sticky before we put our new bar tape on. Very, very important to always clean parts before you actually replace parts. So even things like bar tape, you need to do your preparation before replacing it. Now I'm going to strip down this rear derailleur. Quite a fiddly process, not as easy as a modern derailleur where you can just remove the jockey wheels from the frame and clean those up. With this one, you've got a frame that has that spring in the center of it. It can be quite tricky to work with, but with a little bit of experience it's not too bad. But you can see there it comes apart into several components before we clean and lubricate that. Off comes the chain set now. I'm going to actually split this down because I do need to replace one of the bolts that was missing and put a spacer in, so it makes sense just to completely separate it, sort all the problems out with the one with the long bolt and the one that's missing, get all that correct before we put it back on the bike. All the parts now going in our ultrasonic cleaner that we want to clean off. They run through for about 15 or 20 minutes and then I wash those off with warm soapy water as I'm doing now. So this is washing off the degreaser that's on the component, and then once it's been washed off like this, I'll then dry the component down with an airline and a microfiber towel to get it really, really nice, ready for the final processes. In this instance, it's not only lubricating, but it's also giving those a little bit of an extra polish to make them really pop out once they're back on the bike. So this is one of the brakes here that, again, you can see I'm just washing off that debris that's been through the ultrasonic cleaner. The ultrasonic cleaner has agitated that dirt, lifted it off of the component, and now all I'm doing is just washing that off of the component completely to really, really make it spotlessly clean. Lovely thing about the ultrasonic cleaner is it gets in all the little nitty gritty areas that you cannot get to with a brush or by hand alone, so it really is an aid to the process of servicing a bike. Now I'm going to deal with the brakes. I'm actually going to strip these right the way down to component form, and then I'm actually going to polish the components to really, really make them nice and sparkly once they go back on the bike. So that means absolutely taking this completely apart. There's quite a few components involved with even something as simple as a brake. Lots of these little washers, they all have to go back in the right place. They allow it to pivot and work correctly. There's a washer between each of those layers and then that spring as well. Now I'm going to just buff them on our buffing wheel. I use a fairly soft paste on these that doesn't overshine the component. It just takes off the film of oxidization that's on the parts. Just lift them a little bit, make them a little bit shinier. Again, I'm doing the body here of the derailleur. If I overshine one part, there's a lot of these parts that you can't actually get into with something like this. So you don't want to overshine a part of it to then have a dull part a little bit further up that you couldn't get to. But this, as I mentioned, is one of the cups for the bottom bracket. These really came up nice and they really, really look nice back on the bike. I'm also just going to do the brake levers as well. The front edges of those, really lift them and make it a little bit nicer once everything's back on the bike. Now I'm going to start rebuilding the rear derailleur. So first of all, I'm lubricating the jockey wheels. It does no harm to do that with these. We're using our premium grease there inside the jockey wheel. That will really give a smooth run to that wheel. And I'm also using a little bit of thread locker there on the bottom pivot of the jockey wheel. The top one actually has a lock nut on the back of it, which I'll show you shortly. So this is the top pivot for the top guide pulley of the derailleur itself. It's quite long because it actually runs through the body of the derailleur. It's the way it holds it all together. And then that actuation spring there, I've also just greased up a little bit to stop that going rusty in the future, and that will also help it actuate and move. It was a little bit bent, that spring wasn't quite right, so again that was a good reason for lubricating it, was to just help it do its job of springing back this derailleur. And once it was refitted, it actually was okay. This is that little lock nut on the back of that pivot that I talked about. That is what makes sure that spring is correctly tensioned, and you can see there everything now is working perfectly. And we've got that little shine to the front of that derailleur through polishing it, and I'm just lubricating the inner spring there, and then also these pivot points with our general purpose oil there out of one of our syringes. That I'm now quite happy with, and that's ready to go back on the bike. Next up, I'm going to deal with the chain set. So I needed to take off about 2mm off the back of this bolt. When I actually lined these bolts up, this one was longer than all the others, so it has been replaced at some point in its life, as I suspected, and it was just too long for the hole, and that was what was tapping the chain stay on the bike itself. So I've just sawed that down and got that the right length. I've also found an extra one for the missing one that was on this chain set, and to stop them falling out again, I'm using our thread locker there to make sure that will bind that bolt into the back there and not come undone again. On they go now. We've got 6 of those, so there were the 5 original ones and one that I've actually found a replacement for. You can see the shine on that component. Now the front derailleur also had a little problem here. You can see here the 2 plates are moving. That bolt that runs along the back edge there should actually have a spacer in the middle of it. It was completely missing, yet the bolt was all there, so that's quite rare really. I don't quite know how that would have ever happened, but it was missing. It should look like this. This is one we took off a spare derailleur that we had, so that slips in there. That's as original now, and that will stop those plates from moving in and out and causing bad shifting on the front of the bike. I would imagine that it would have never quite shifted correctly, this bike, because they would have spread either as it was pulling out the chain or dropping down the chain. But we've got that now absolutely perfect. With any bike of this nature that I'm servicing or restoring, I do always replace the brake pads. The rubber on the brake pads will go hard with age. It won't perform very well. Brakes of this nature never work that well anyway, so it is important to replace the brake pads, and I do that as a matter of course. Even if I can't match the pads, I will still replace them. From a safety point of view, it makes total sense to do that when you're servicing. I'm using a little bit of our silicone grease here. This is because this spring actually slides up and down the frame of the brake, and it will give that a little bit of smoothness to the actuation. And again, the pivot points of the brakes here, no harm in oiling them. Our general purpose oil on those works well, and the same with the skewer. A little bit of general purpose oil on the actuator, general purpose grease along the shaft, and then a little bit of our anti-seize grease on the threads. And this will actually stop this binding in the axle of the wheel, and we'll be able to slide that in and out and actuate nicely. Now this was a little bit of a disappointment to me. This, you can see here that the rear free hub is very notchy, the bearings are life extinct, and you would have seen in other videos where we actually service these, we take them apart. But in general, I think the manufacturers treat these as a non-serviceable part. They're almost a throwaway part. On vintage bikes like this, I do like to service them, and you would have seen that in other videos. But with this bike, I could not get that one apart. We tried every trick that we had at our disposal, all the various tools that we've used over the years, but that one was not coming apart. So sadly, I had to replace that free hub, and it just wasn't quite right in keeping with the bike, but it is what it is. It's about servicing and getting them rolling nicely. So once we'd had a look at that, we also needed to do the wheel bearings. Again, you can see here, you'll notice, especially when I take the bearings out this side, there's a lot of grease in there. I think this has been well packed out with grease. They probably took this cover off, re-greased that cover, pushed it back on the original bearings without actually removing them or cleaning them. So it was right and proper that we actually took all this axle out, degreased everything, cleaned all this new and old grease from the cups themselves before putting in brand new bearings. I'm using there a brass bristle brush, which won't scratch or damage anything there, and then a little bit of wire wool there before spraying that down and cleaning it up. The cups weren't perfect in this wheel, but again, with vintage bikes of this nature, They often are pitted and marked, but it usually runs okay when you put new bearings in them. They sometimes are a little bit noisy, but the nature of vintage bikes, you have to accept that really, in that to replace one wheel that then would never match the front wheel, or to match the pair, would be very, very difficult for this era of bikes. So as long as it's got new bearings, new grease, everything will be mechanically sound and running nicely. So there's no harm in just doing the bearings and keeping the original cups if necessary. So we're cleaning off the spokes and the wheels, checking everything, and then we'll put in our nice premium grease in here and some fresh bearings before getting everything back together. So we're popping in these bearings here. You can see that they sit on that grease very, very nicely. This grease is great for holding bearings against gravity, as you'll see in the headset bearings. As we move on to those, I'll explain why we use this grease and just how good it is for bearing work especially. So in goes the axle, on go the lock nuts. We adjust the bearings up, tighten off the lock nuts. Everything there now is absolutely spot on. I'm using a little bit of anti-seize grease on the aluminium here of the hub that holds the free hub on, and on goes a brand new 7-speed free hub there. So although it's not original, it is now new, which means it's got a full life expectancy, and the bike will run very, very nicely with that on there. Inflate the tyres. The tyres were actually flat when the bike came in. Nice cap on there, and that wheel is now ready to fit. Now the front wheel, obviously we had this buckling in it, so you can see the graph on the left there. The asterisks are all spokes that are either too tight or too loose. Once I've worked round left and right, I get those all within 10% of each other, which is how I've got that. And you can see a more visual representation there. That was the spokes as they came in. Some sides are pulled against each other, each side of each other. So some are too tight, some are too loose. And once I get that more even distribution left and right, everything there is now perfect, and it's no longer buckled. So I'm quite pleased with the wheels as well when they went back on this bike. Now I'm going to deal with the headset bearings. It was a similar story here as on the rest of the bike. You can see that there's an awful lot of grease, the white lithium grease there, put over the bearings, but I don't feel the cups themselves were actually cleaned because there was a lot of old grease within that. So we are going to clean everything down. So we took the forks completely off the bike and we give this a clean. Again, I'm using that brass brush there that won't scratch or damage the races in any way. And then we will just clean that off with a little bit of degreaser, and you can see they're ready to go. So we wipe that down with a microfiber towel to get all that degreaser off and all the old grease. And the same with the cups on the actual frame themselves. Give those a little clean down, a little bit of degreaser on there, get all that old oil off of the bike so that we can put fresh oil on there. Now, you would have seen in other videos, I don't tend to use races on the headset bearings. I tend to use loose ball bearings as I'm using here. This premium grease is perfect for this. It will hold the bearings against gravity so they won't fall out, and it's a lovely creamy grease that really works well and keeps these waterproof and nicely running. The reason I use loose ball bearings is you do get pitting on headset bearings on vintage bikes. If I load it with individual balls rather than a ball race with a few bearings in it, it will support the headset against those pitted areas, and it will just run that much nicer once it's all put together. So that really makes a smooth headset by doing that. Manufacturers are lazy, they just want to throw them in at a factory. It's a little bit of a subtle difference really that makes the bike really ride very, very nicely. The steering becomes very positive on an aging bike of this nature. Now I'm going to wash the frame down. The Bianchi bikes have this beautiful, beautiful paintwork on them. This had a rich colour paint on this. So initially I'm going to wash it down here with a big softy brush. This has very, very soft bristles. It's quite important with these, the decals on these, the actual logos around the frame are all glued on and they're not lacquered over like perhaps more modern bikes. So we don't want those to lift off of the frame. So it's important to use a nice soft brush like that to stop those decals coming off of the frame. And then I can use a new microfiber towel. Again, microfiber towels will really absorb water very, very freely. You don't need to push too hard, which means you're not going to damage those logos. Now I'm going to use our super resin polish on the frame. This will really bring this paint out. It will really, really supple it up and draw out that shine, draw off the debris and dirt that's on the frame. And again, I'm being very, very cautious on the stickers that are on the bike, the Bianchi logo. We don't want to peel any of those off or lift up any edges. We just want to subtly clean the frame with this lovely, lovely creamy polish. And the shine and the depth of shine that we get on this frame, it really, really lifted this frame and absolutely lifted the service and the rebuild of this bike to bring it to the next level. Now, once I have polished it, I'm also going to use the Rapid Ceramic Spray. This makes a massive difference to the frames. It adds a final shine to the frame, but beyond that, it really aids waterproofing the bike. The water beads up on the paint rather than soaking into it, and it almost locks in your polish. It's great on older bikes as they're prone to rust, and doing this regularly will stop the bike from deteriorating any further than it already has. Now on the chainstay here, it had an original Bianchi chainstay protector. It was lifting up at one edge, so what I did, I just heated that up with a heat gun to reactivate the sticky, the same on this Made in Italy sign here. Just a little bit of warmth on there. The glue is still there, it's just aged off and lifted, and that will just enable us to rebond these details back onto the frame. Now I'm going to work on the bottom bracket, so I'm using our anti-seize grease here on the cup itself, and then I'm going to use our premium grease to put the new bearings in. We sell all these things on our website. These are all items that we've used professionally over the years, and when we started YouTube we realized that people were interested in buying these products, so you can buy these on our website. The link's always in the description below, but that will be the lubricants, the cleaners, the cables, the chains, various other things that we use in all the other videos. An awful lot of those are available from ourselves. It's the way that we support our own channel, and it's the way that you can support us. So do check out the link in the description below. Pop over to our website and place an order for us. Now the bottom bracket is in, and I'm now going to address these handlebars with this sticky residue on them and make sure that we clean those up before we put fresh bar tape on this. So I'm using a little bit of wire wool. That works very, very well. These are steel handlebars, so that works out very well at getting that debris off. And I'm also just going to take out the bolt of the quill there because it was a little bit brown on the top and I wanted just to polish that off. So again, I went to our polishing wheel and look at the difference there. How easy is that just to clean up a bolt end? It's a very, very subtle thing, but that was a chromed bolt on the tip. So once that's in there, look at that. Perfect. That's a nice finish and detail to the bike. It's the sort of thing that you do see when you're riding because that's the area that you're looking at. So on go the handlebars. Now we can start to rebuild those. So first of all, we put the brake levers back on. We do actually mark the handlebars so that we know that they're going back in the same position. And then once they're in that position, I can torque those up. The brake levers on these do need torquing up before you put the cables in, otherwise you can't get to the mount bolt, so it's important to torque that up before you put the cables in. On goes the chain set. It was quite satisfying. This, you'll see me do a spin test in a moment. Once the new cotter pins are in, I'll do those up, and it was very, very nice when I spun this that it spun so freely, as you'll see now. Look at that. I love this generation of bearings. Are really, really nice. That was completely worlds apart from how the bike came in, and also we haven't got that irritating tapping noise. Absolutely perfect. Very, very happy with that chain set. Now we were very, very fortunate that in our spares box we had these nice pedals that were a world away from the modern mountain bike pedals that this bike had on it, so we popped those on, and that really is a detail to me that finishes the bike. It's very subtle, but it will bring the bike back to where it should be in terms of styling for the era that it was produced in. On go the derailleurs now, and there's a little cap there that we pop on. You have to be very careful with that, they can get very brittle. On go the shifters, again everything there working perfectly, nicely cleaned up, ready for the cables. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put all the components on the bike, and then I'm going to recable it as a one entity. So on go those brakes, you can see there they've now got that lovely reflection and they're nicely cleaned up. They've been lubricated, new brake pads, everything there is good. And with the accessory bolts, as I mentioned earlier, I actually replaced these with brand new ones. It was just one of those subtle differences. The heads on the other ones were very, very poor, so we replaced those. And we also had a new old stock saddle there that was actually almost identical. It was the same make, the livery was just slightly different colors to the original, but I also popped that on this bike to really finish the detailing on this bike and make it very nice. Next up, we're putting new cables, so these are new outers, and we're using our super slick stainless steel cables on this one. These are a lovely tightly wound cable. They're very smooth through your fingers, and they actuate beautifully, these cables. So we're putting those onto this bike. Front and rear brake cables and the shifter cables are all the lovely stainless steel cables. These are the details to me that really make a difference to a finished bike of this nature. A lot of bikes like this would have originally come with galvanized steel cables. They tarnish off. The stainless steel really reflects the light, and again, it's one of those things that really lifts the bike when it's been serviced, and the way it presents and the way it looks. New bar tape on here, so I mark that to the bottom edge of the handlebar, and then I taper that off on the outside edge there, and then I will tape this onto the frame. And what I like to try and do with these is the very final tail, I like that to be underneath the handlebars, at the bottom of the handlebars. Same with the tape here, I cut that off and make sure that that goes around to the bottom of the handlebars so you don't see it from the top, and also the smoothness of it you don't see from the top of the handlebars looking down. New rear and front derailleur cables are going in here now, so they go in the shifters first. Tuck those in, make sure that they're in their correct spot at the top end before I bring them down to the bottom end. So first of all, we're going to put in the front derailleur cable here. That's fed round the back of the frame into its own fitting. Pinch that cable up again, no thumb adjuster, as it's all done on the friction shifter. Lastly, for that front derailleur cable, I just have to cut that cable short so that it doesn't tap on the frame and then crimp the end on it. The rear derailleur, it was a little bit odd, this one, it didn't quite sit nicely in the frame fitting, but the bike when it came in had a cable tie on there to hold that down, and for us there wasn't really another way of doing that. It actually made sense to repeat that. It was how the bike came in, although I know the bike would never have had that originally. It may have had some form of clip there, but we didn't have that available to us, so we repeated what was on the bike when it came in. So there's no harm in that. Sometimes you have to think outside the box with these sort of restorations and do things you may not be 100% happy with, but that is okay. Now we're going to put one of our lovely silver chains on here. These chains I really like for this sort of restoration because they're chrome plates on these, and they really look nice with the era of the bikes. They're much nicer than perhaps a matte black or a matte grey chain would be on there. They again lift the detailing of the bike to the next level, and the lovely shiny chain on this lovely shiny chrome work really works for me. I do like these chains on specifically this type of restoration. Again, they're available on our website. So I've gone through the gears, made sure everything's working there. I checked the brakes are working and they're not fouling the wheel or rubbing. Everything there is good. So I'm now very happy with the bike. I'm going to torque it up now. There's not a lot to do with the torquing because most of this is nuts and bolts and done by feel as you're putting the bike together. But there are one or two there that we can check and make sure that everything's right. Obviously we've changed the saddle, so I need to check things like that. And you can see here from these before and afters what an absolute huge difference we've made to this bike. Really is now a special bike. It's gone from a tired and sad, very neglected bike to something you can really be proud of. I would be very proud of this if it was my bike. You can see here what a massive difference such a service makes, but it's all on the inside. All the bearings have been done, everything's nice, new cables, the subtle differences on the inside that make a bike like this. Look at that, what a massive difference. So pleased with this bike. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.